In early August of 2002, I was transferred to High Desert State Prison. We were on lockdown at that time, so my first couple of weeks there I spent pretty much exclusively in the company of my cellie, Blanky. I'd done about a year at this point, and sitting on a piece of steel, staring up at a concrete ceiling, I was used to this. I knew how to do time, as it were. But I had not yet experienced a lockdown. During a lockdown, your cellie is your only real interaction. You wake up together because it's not like one of you is going to sleep while the other one's moving around. You eat the same garbage meals that are slid through the tray slot. You watch the same shows on TV. You get mail and then talk about it with each other. You don't have to like your cellie on a lockdown, but it's guaranteed that you're going to get to know him because he is going to be the person that you talk to, the person you interact with for days or weeks, months. Back in the shoe, it's years. Cellies can go without really interacting with anybody but each other. The first 3 weeks that I was there, I didn't get any mail, I didn't have any phone calls. I had the opportunity to get to know Blinky really well. Thankfully, after about 3 weeks, we did come off of lockdown, and I got to go out to my first day room at High Desert State Prison in the evening. I've already spoken briefly about the serendipitous connection between myself and Vertigo and meeting him, but after I met him, I met the shot caller for the building, Stu. Stu really stood out as a contrast to Sam. Sam had been militant, ready to go. If the riot kicked off, he was ready, and he made it clear that you'd better be ready too. That was not the way that Stu approached being a shot caller. He was laid back, and I don't mean laid back like, hey dude, it's nice to meet you, this is a chill place, just kick it. I mean laid back like calm, orderly. He came over and shook my hand, and I'd expected his speech about the mandatories, mandatory yard, mandatory workout. It was nothing like that. He introduced himself. He told me who the officers were in the building that I needed to be careful of. Told me what inmates had what jobs. If I wanted to buy breakfast burritos, go talk to Frank. If I needed something passed, I should go talk to Bob. And if I liked drugs, well, right over there is the drug guy. He was polite, and I felt like he was really just getting to know me and making sure that I understood how to do time, that I knew what the mandatories were, that I wasn't going to cause any problems in his building. Near the end of the conversation, he thought for a second, and he asked if I'd had a chance to make a phone call. I hadn't, and he pretty much immediately turned to another white guy and asked if he'd be willing to give me his phone time. You see, phone calls are scheduled in 15-minute slots. The phone will work for 15 minutes before it turns itself off, and you have a time slot, for instance, 9 p.m. to 9:15 p.m., in which you are allowed to make phone calls. You sign up for that time slot in advance by asking an officer to sign you up for that slot. It wasn't an incredibly big deal that this guy was giving me his phone time because he'd been off lockdown. I was just coming off. It was a very big deal for me to make a phone call. It probably wasn't a big sacrifice to him. That said, it was a big deal to me. This was a kind gesture. Sam, the shot caller back at San Quentin, and Stu both, they reached out and made little gestures. I got a pair of boots from Sam, and I got a phone call from Stu, and it was a way to welcome me into the fold, to let me know I was a member of the group. It's a very wise thing for a leader to do, to make a small gesture to a new member. Sam stood out as a contrast to Stu in a lot of ways. But it made sense, really, because, you see, Stu was the shot caller for the building. He did not have the keys to the yard. He was not the guy who had went back to the shoe and been introduced to the shot callers and who was in charge of making sure that everything ran. That guy had just decided that Stu should be in charge of 3 Block, the building where I was, and make sure that nothing went wrong. His job really wasn't about calling shots, it was just about being in charge, being a symbol of order. And he did a great job at it. I think everybody trusted him in some degree, and everybody respected him because he'd been in the building for a long time. You see, he couldn't appear weak or timid, even though he wasn't trying to kick off a riot. He didn't want to seem like the guy that was trying to start a war either. If he had been too aggressive, too militant, he could have caused problems. He could have made it so that somebody thought it was a good idea to go over and start problems with the wrong guy. Conversely, if he'd been too weak and timid, whenever some big angry skinhead gang member came to him and described their problem that they wanted to utilize violence to solve, they probably weren't going to listen to him. If he said, well, gee, please don't do that, man, you could get us in trouble. He had to present the right face of being both reasonable and rational, but also willing to take it to 10 if it had to. He couldn't appear to be a coward. Meeting the shot caller to the side, I got to get on the phone that evening, and I was locked up for a long time. I had a lot of emotionally raw experiences, a lot of things that really just opened me up. This was one of the more intense experiences emotionally that I had while in prison. I hadn't spoken to my wife or my mother in months, and they hadn't known what San Quentin was going to be like. Whenever I did last speak to them, I'd done it with the real knowledge that I might not survive San Quentin. I didn't cry, I didn't make a scene, but speaking to my wife and then my mother, it was my whole world. It was what I was doing at that time. And I didn't notice the guy who very politely, hey, excuse me, brother, it's my phone time. You're on my time right now. I kept talking to my wife, and hey, just give me a minute, man, it's all right. I didn't think what I was doing. This is a serious environment. It's not all right. It's not just give me a minute. The guy just told me I was being discourteous to him, and I ignored him. He raised his voice a little. Hey, brother, excuse me, you're on my phone time, man. I heard it that time, and thank goodness I did, because I was being actively rude. I apologized quickly. I stopped the call with my wife and my mother, and sorry guys, I gotta go, and I hung up a little too fast. I hope they didn't think I was being brusque. It was just important for me to hand that phone off to this guy. It was his time. He wanted to talk to his wife or his mother or whoever. As I stepped away from the phone, I looked up. Vertigo was already on his way over. It was immediate eye contact, and he walked right over to me and said, hey, you all right, man? You ain't got a problem right now, right? I literally had this man watching my back, as in somebody just raised their voice a little bit to me, and whenever I looked up, he was fast walking over, and if there was a problem, he was going to be there before it started. You cannot put a price on that in prison. Somebody that will legitimately watch your back. I asked before if it was a good thing or a bad thing. This was a treasure. You cannot overestimate how important it is that you have somebody watching your back in prison. That was it. That was my day room. That was my first time out there at High Desert. And I went back to my cell, lay on that little chunk of steel like I always did, stared up at the concrete ceiling, and I asked myself the same questions that I always did. What did I learn that day? What do I wish that I'd learned the day before so that I could have known it that day when it started? I reflected on the nature of power and authority. You figure Stu was a shot caller in a prison gang. That's not generally a job that somebody finds a way to make the world a better place in doing. But I really felt like that's what he did. He showed small kindnesses to people whenever they needed it. He exercised authority, but with a hands-off approach. He didn't walk around telling people what to do. He was just in charge and trying to keep things calm, trying to essentially keep everybody safe. We can't always choose what groups, organizations we'll belong to, what jobs we'll have. Sometimes you just have to take whatever position you end up in. And if it's a bad group that you're a part of, if you find yourself as a shot caller in a prison gang, or perhaps more likely in a low-level managerial position for a company that you don't think makes the world a better place, someplace you don't like working for, that doesn't mean you can't make the world a better place, because the choices that we make in a day don't necessarily have to reflect values that are not our own. I never got the impression that Stu was all about the gang. He was just a decent guy trying to do a decent job in the environment he was in. Really, I suppose that's the most any of us can hope for.